There is a way to engage in civil dialogue. Nothing really big has ever happened in this country or anywhere in the world that didn't involve a discourse that can take place in an environment that's a neutral environment, in an environment where people feel free to express themselves, but also feel free to listen to each other.
Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. All right, that got your attention. Good evening, I'm Roger Dower. I'm the president of the Johnson Foundation. I want to warmly welcome all of you to Wingspread and to thank you all for taking time out on a sort of a stormy evening to join us, but also to thank you for being here and being part of our kickoff of our new community initiative on resilient communities. We'll learn more about that as we go on, but I want to thank you here. But perhaps by way of introduction, I can say a few words about how we got to where we are today. So for almost 60 years, with the generous support of the S.C. Johnson family, this foundation has served as a place to act as a catalyst for collaborative solutions to big problems of the day. For much of our history, until relatively recently, we tended to focus our attention on global and national issues, but about 7 years ago, we began to experiment with how we might apply our collaborative tools and the kinds of convenings we do here to issues facing us right here at home in our Racine community. And I know a number of you have participated in a couple of those at least, our work on infant mortality issues here in Racine and children's mental health. It's based in no small part our experience with that, and I'll say success with that, the board asked us to sort of double down on our work in the community, to take much of our resources and apply it to one or more initiatives in our community that can make a difference. And as we thought through the sort of options for our focus, we kept on coming back to this notion of resilient communities and what it might mean for Racine, and what it might mean for a whole host of issues that we need to tackle in this community. That led us to go back to the board and propose that, and about last fall, at some point, the board said, go for it. And that's where we are today. So you're gonna learn a lot more about our initiative and what a resilient community is from Ashley Stake, a program officer for the Johnson Foundation, and from our featured speaker. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say one more time, thank you all for being here to help us kick it off. Ashley?
Thank you, Roger. I also want to welcome you all here tonight, those of you that are here in person and also our online audience. We couldn't squeeze another person in here, as you can see, and our online discussion and dialogue is just beginning, and we want to invite all of you to participate in that as well. So I'm here for all of the same reasons that you are, because I love Racine. I'm from Racine. I grew up in Mount Pleasant, bought my first house in the city, my current home in Caledonia. I work in Wind Point. My husband was also born and raised here. And our family is sprinkled all throughout kind of our neighborhood of communities. Neil and I made a conscious decision to live here, raise our family here, and try to give back to the community that gave us so much. And when we think about home, we don't think about one specific town or community or village. We think about it all. And that's how we think about it here at the Johnson Foundation as well. And as Roger mentioned, the foundation's commitment to the communities that we call home is stronger now more than ever. That's why we've devoted our resources for the past year learning about how other communities are trying to make their future better too. For the next 3 weeks, we'll be sharing with you what we've learned through our Resilient Communities briefing series, which focuses on 3 key questions over the next 3 weeks. What are resilient communities? Are we resilient? And what does our future look like? In addition to looking at other communities, we asked the Public Policy Forum to take a closer, fact-based look at ours. The trends are troubling, and we're at a tipping point. The good news is that we've seen how communities like ours have become stronger and better for all. 4 common themes have emerged in each success story that we've seen. First, visionary, cross-sector, cross-border leadership that embraces change. Second, recognition of the sum of the whole being greater than the individual parts. Third, neighboring community governmental collaboration. And finally, a sense of urgency to stop negative trends before effects fully manifest. For the first time ever, we're inviting everyone in our neighborhood of communities, Caledonia, Elmwood Park, Mount Pleasant, North Bay, Sturtevant, and Wind Point, and Racine, to join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. It's that important. The series is the first step in our efforts to begin a new kind of dialogue on the future of our communities. Once it's over, we'll be taking it on the road, meeting one-on-one with groups and government councils throughout our region, sharing both learnings from the experts and feedback from all of you. Ultimately, we hope leaders will accept our open invitation to come to Wingspread, come to the table in spirit of cooperation to explore the possibilities and determine what can and must be done now to put our communities on a path to resiliency. When we all work together, we go farther than we could on our own, and when our neighbor does well, we do too. So please enjoy, engage over the next 3 weeks and tonight, share your ideas and become a part of this conversation. I am thrilled to be able to have the honor to introduce our first speaker in our series, Dr. Kate Foster. You all have Dr. Kate Foster's bio, and I just want to say that what drew us to her was her work with Brookings Institute and the MacArthur Foundation, where she helped regions like ours grapple with some of the same issues that we have and come out better as a whole. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Foster.
Thank you. So the best piece of advice I ever got when I was moving from New York State to Maine about 5 years ago was never pretend to be a Mainer. You won't be able to pull it off, they said, and people will resent you for trying. So fast forward to this moment. I am not from Racine. I am not from Wisconsin. I'm not even from the Midwest. And I want you to know from the outset that I am not coming here to tell you what you should do. It's your job to listen to what we've learned about resilience over the time I've been studying it with a number of other people, and to really think hard about your community as I go through some of the lessons and insights that we've gotten from the work we've done on resilient communities. So that's on you. Now that said, I was in Buffalo, New York for 18 years, and it lends itself to a wonderful prologue on resilience. Some of you are already shaking your heads. That's remarkable. You know what I'm going to say. So I lived there in a long period. So let's start. January of 1991, Super Bowl 25. Those of you who are titters right around the room right now already. You know where I'm going. Super Bowl 25, New York Giants versus the Buffalo Bills. Bills had won the AFC, going to the Super Bowl, very exciting. And in the last part of the game, as the score was 20-19 with the Giants ahead by 1 point. The Buffalo Bills had a chance to win the game with a field goal, 47-yard field goal by Scott Norwood, and it went wide right. Wide right has become a metaphor saying in Buffalo, New York, wide right, that's wide right, wide right. And they lose the game. That's very, very sad, of course, to lose a game by 1 point when you had a chance to win it on the last play. Now, the next period, I don't have to take too long. 1992, they come back. They're resilient. They make it into the Super Bowl again against the Washington Redskins. And perhaps you know, and you can tell by the face of Jim Kelly, the quarterback, they lose 37-24. Pretty significant drumming. You know, can't win on the last play of the game when it's 37-24. So they lose again. But remarkably, January of 1993, they're back again. And by now, 75% of the country can't stand the Buffalo Bills because they're so sick of them, but they come back and they're resilient and they get back into the Super Bowl again. Super Bowl 27, I guess it is, against the Dallas Cowboys. And the Dallas Cowboys, 9 turnovers later by the Buffalo Bills. You might notice that's Jim Kelly again. You're not supposed to be on the ground when somebody's scoring over you when you're on the offense. 9 turnovers, they lose 52-17. It's a remarkable national embarrassment. The team, you know, how can you be more than demoralized by that? But et voila, a year later, in January of 1994, the Buffalo Bills are back in the Super Bowl. Back in the Super Bowl for the 4th year in a row. And it's a rematch against the Dallas Cowboys, and they are ahead at the half, 13-6. And then 24 unanswered points later, by the Dallas Cowboys, they lose the game, 30-13. So this is a tragedy, as you might imagine, in a region. They lost 4 Super Bowls in a row, went to the Super Bowl 4 times in a row. And after the first one, the cerebral, and I should say very intellectual coach of the Buffalo Bills, Marv Levy, had left in the locker room as the players are clearing out their locker room, everyone's dejected, left in the locker room an excerpt from a poem, an old British poem from 1700s, I think. And this is what it said. It said, "Fight on, my men," Sir Andrew said. "I'm a little hurt, but not yet slain. I'll just lie down and bleed a while, and then I'll rise and fight again." Now, I don't know if he left this, Marv Levy, every year they lost the Super Bowl, but every year they rose and they fought again. Now, a few years after that, Marv Levy in 2001 was quoted as saying what you see here. I'd like to be able to say that we won one of them, or all 4, but that's not going to change. Yet each time our athletes showed their resilience, they got right back to work. The only way to win a Super Bowl is to get into it. And I've heard him say this a number of times since then, on documentaries, people coming back on anniversaries of all of this that's going on. So this is my prologue on resilience, to say I come from a resilient community, a community that was willing to stand up and fight again, which is pretty impressive in and of itself. But I also use it to get into the presentation, what we're going to do tonight. Why resilience? What is it? What about Racine? Not because I know about you, but because I'm going to introduce some data, a little bit of data on what we did on resilient communities, and then you're going to tell me later that that just doesn't seem to resonate with you. Talk a little bit about the missing pieces in that work so that you can put it into context. Then I'll also share what I call the 7 paths to 1 + 1 = 3, that notion of communities having more together than they have separately. And then finally, a coda, where I'm going to give you a few bonus questions. So let's start with why resilience. Why? Well, the first answer is because it's on your mind. I was asked to come here this evening because you've been thinking about resilience, you've been thinking about the future of your community, environmentally, socially, economically, and you said, let's learn a little bit more about resilient communities. And the second reason why resilience would be because it's been on my mind for a long time. I've been thinking a lot about regions, metropolitan regions, through the course of my career. It's what I've studied. It's where my scholarship is. And in particular, from about 2004 onward, thinking about particularly how resilient a region was, and particularly thinking about metropolitan regions in that context, and saying how resilient are they. So as part of a national research project, as was said in the introduction, on building resilient regions, it was sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation. I did work with a number of people around the country who were experts at this work. And we did a bit of research, some of which I'll show you later in the presentation. But resilient because it's been on my mind. And finally, why resilience? Because it's on everyone's mind. Right around as we were getting started with the Building Resilient Regions project, 2005, Katrina came through New Orleans. And there was a tremendous amount of thinking about would they bounce back? And what would bounce back? Would the people bounce back? Would the environment bounce back? Would the levees bounce back? What was it? How could they be better? Because as you may recall, there was quite a bit of disaster about the aftermath of Katrina. It did not go well. So a Time report, Time magazine, An American Tragedy, it was on everyone's mind. It also led to a whole number of books on bouncing back, communities bouncing back. So we got things like Rising from Katrina, How My Community Came Back. Then you began having a number of books on community resilience. Resilience became a word that people were using in a number of fields, but particularly about natural disasters. So quite a bit on bouncing back from an earthquake or a hurricane or any other kind of natural disaster. Resilience became so powerful as a term that it found its way into the business community. So the resilience of a supply chain, the resilience of my business coming back from some kind of a downturn, the resilience of my business in an economic, more global downturn. So the power of resilience, how the best companies manage the unexpected, bringing in that notion of risk, bringing in notions of vulnerability. How could I manage resilience? Resilience had long been a part of the self-help literature. It's long been a part of the psychology literature. How do people bounce back from things that might afflict them, whether it's divorce, a health issue, loss of a loved one, et cetera. So you get a number of books on the resilience as well in that area. Engineering was using resilience. Resilience of a bridge, resilience of any kind of road structure, resilience of your process, your systems of transportation. So you get a number of books about resilience in engineering. Resilience in general, resilience about why things bounce back, both philosophically and psychologically. You get resilience now primers on regional resilience. This is what we were studying by, in this case, the Institute on Sustainable Communities. You get resilience and that whole metaphor of, the clown doll that you knock down and gets back up. You get that kind of resilience facing down rejection. And what is it? And facing down rejection and criticism on the road to success. So again, a kind of the flavor of self-help as well. And then finally, just really about a month or two ago, Sheryl Sandberg comes out, the author of Lean In, and she writes a book, Option B, Facing Adversity, Building Resilience, and Finding Joy. The building being very important there. We had been using the notion of building resilience and the notion that you can build it. It's not something innate, it's not DNA, it's something you can build. So you get a lot of this. You even through this, you get the children's literature. Bouncing Back, a book about resilience. So you're getting a lot of people thinking about it. So the answer to why resilience is not only it's on your mind and it was on my mind, but it's been on everyone's mind. So let's work from that to say, or move from that to say, well, what is it then? What is it that people are talking about? Well, the easiest metaphor is, in fact, the bounce back metaphor. Recover from a stress, recover from a strain, recover from a blow. You bounce back. So I have to have you watch this slide right now because it took me an hour to put it together. This clown doll that was going to fall down and come back up. So here you go. You see it once. All right, it's not great. But it's there. Okay, it did it. All right, it bounced back. So that's resilience. In the shorthand, it's just bouncing back from a blow, a stress. The interesting thing about that is that the notion of resilience seems to convey the fact that you'll bounce back to normal. You'll get back to where you were. The clown doll will come back, or the region will come back. And there are instances where we calibrate to normal. So if you calibrate to normal, let's say your temperature is 98.6, and then you get a fever, the job is to bounce back to 98.6. That would be calibrating to normal. Same with, let's say you have an oil spill on a shoreline. What you want is for people to bounce back, to get things back to the way they were. That's a big part of resilience, is that notion that we're going back to what we had before. But there's also a very important element or conception or part of thinking about resilience and that concept is to say there may be instances where you don't want to bounce back to normal. This was the New Orleans story with Katrina. Normal wasn't great in New Orleans. Part of what Katrina did was open up and kind of tear off the top of the box to say, we have some real issues here, economically and socially and in terms of our infrastructure. So bouncing back to normal became something we thought about a lot with regions. Maybe they needed to bounce back to a place in a different plane, a place that was perhaps more transformational than it was calibrating to normal. And the best story about that I know is the story of San Francisco. This is a picture of San Francisco in the 1980s, taken an aerial toward the Bay Bridge. So you can imagine you're on the northern sort of side of San Francisco. Behind you is going to be Marin County. The Golden Gate Bridge is going to be off to your, well, past the bridge. I can't do your right and my right at the same time. But that's the Bay Bridge. So you're looking down toward the tower building in San Francisco, the Port of San Francisco. And this is the picture of it then. And some of you may recall that in October of 1989, and you may recall it because it was when there was a World Series game going on. It was just about to start between the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland Athletics. So the teams were playing each other right across the bay there. There was a significant earthquake with large magnitude. And it knocked down that freeway. Oops, I didn't say. See that freeway there? That's the Embarcadero Freeway that went along sort of the waterfront in San Francisco. This is the tower building. You can see the beginnings of the piers here. This is just the top of where the pier would come through. And this is the Embarcadero Freeway. This is the Bay Bridge. So it knocks it down. And it devastates many parts of the area. And this, as you can see, one level had collapsed into the other. And the question is, do you bounce back to normal? And bouncing back to normal for San Francisco would have meant rebuilding the Embarcadero Freeway, which was clearly an important freeway for getting traffic off the Bay Bridge and in and around parts of San Francisco. But it was also loathed, this freeway. Many people hated this freeway. It had blocked that waterfront and that pier, and they thought it was ugly, and you can see how it had looked from the aerial. So after quite a bit of deliberation, they determined that they were not going to bounce back to normal. They were going to bounce back to something different. And this is San Francisco after this Loma Prieta earthquake. And you can see now the tower building there. You can see the piers again coming down here. And you can see that this is now a promenade with, of course, now restaurants and retail and all sorts of touristy kinds of things, but things for the native population, the resident population of San Francisco as well. And this is a picture now you can see you can get to the water. Getting to the water is always a big deal. It's always nice to get to the water. And now you can walk from sort of that downtown financial district of San Francisco right to the tower building, which is full of all these wonderful eateries and places to go. So this is a great example of resilience bouncing back to something other than normal. What else is resilience? A couple of other important facets here and distinguishments. When we're thinking about resilience, we distinguish between the kinds of things that prompt you to be resilient. So for example, a bridge collapsing, that's a picture from when the bridge collapsed in Minneapolis. When that bridge collapsed, that's an acute shock. No one knew that bridge was about to collapse, least of all the people on it, obviously. And so no one knows that. That's an acute moment. Nothing can warn you about that. That happens. And that's a kind of shock that you can bounce back from. There's a second kind of strain, and it's what you might call chronic stress. And chronic stress is not something that happened overnight. It didn't happen in a moment. It wasn't a bridge collapsing. Maybe it happened over 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. Maybe it happened over a period of deindustrialization, where it was small little things happening at a time, maybe a business closing, maybe a family moving away, maybe a business moving away, maybe a challenge with a school district. Whatever it was, it happened slowly. And the chronic stress, one day you wake up and you've got a community that isn't what you had before. And the question is, what kind of resilience do you have to that? When it isn't to the moment, the acute shock is almost easier to recover from. Everybody marshals their resources, you get back together, you come in together as a group. Chronic stress is hard to bounce back from because you never know when is the moment. When is the moment that we begin to bounce back? Or are we still in some kind of a chronic stress situation? So we studied a lot of this and thought a lot about these strains. We can talk about them in the Q&A. Very importantly, as we did our research, but as other people were doing their thinking about resilience, was to distinguish between facets of resilience. So on the one hand, you could say everything I've described so far is about resilience as a performance. How well did we bounce back? How well do I as a person bounce back? Did ourselves as a place and a region bounce back? A thing bouncing back, like a bridge or a hospital system? How well did we bounce back from that strain? That's a performance. And you would measure that after the catastrophe, after the thing that had happened, after the stress. But another thing to think about would be that resilience is also a capacity. Since we don't know what will happen in the future, how prepared could we be for bouncing back? What could we do now in terms of anticipating or preparing for an unknown future stress or strain? How could we prepare ourselves? How could we build capacity to be resilient in the moment? It's much harder to measure the first one, performance, because you have to wait for a number of situations that are similar enough that you can say, okay, we've now got 20 apples here rather than apples and oranges, and we can compare them. But what we thought in the project I was working on was that we could measure capacity because we could read about what other people had said are the factors or the drivers of being resilient. We could measure those things for metropolitan regions, and then we could say that place has capacity to be resilient. That's not a guarantee that it will be, but it has the capacity to be. I think the best way to think about that would be to imagine personalizing it. How prepared are you as a person to recover from a strain? And there are all sorts of strains coming up on the screen right now, and as you can see, some of those strains or stresses are actually positive things. You win the lottery, that's actually pretty stressful. A new job can be stressful. A new baby is stressful. A new home is stressful. So how resilient are you to those changes in your life, but also to a number of other things up there? How resilient could you be? Now, I won't ask this question of you other than rhetorically, but you can imagine for yourselves, if I were to ask that now, what would you draw upon if you lost your job? If you have a job and you lost your job, what would you draw upon? And I know I think about myself, I think, how resilient am I? What's my capacity to be resilient? And at least with respect to losing a job, I think, well, you know, I have some skills and I have a good education, I've got a good degree, you know, maybe I've got some friends and contacts. There are things I could draw upon to recover from the stress of losing my job tomorrow. And you can imagine that as well for any of these kinds of things. What would I draw upon? We set out in our project to measure these kinds of things for places. We said, what are the kinds of things that places could draw upon? What were the factors and the drivers of resilience? So let me tell you about that right now as part of not only what is resilience, but where is Racine in all this? And the first thing we did was we said, how could you measure that capacity? And we said, well, let's divide it into kinds of things. There's a category of sort of the regional economy, the capacity of a regional economy to bounce back. And then there's a capacity of factors we might measure for social, for people, socio-demographic characteristics. And what's the capacity of the people in that area to be resilient to stresses and strains? And finally, we said there's a category that we think is about the community and its connectivity is what we called it, kind of civic characteristics and attributes, and what were they? And we wound up measuring 4 in each of these categories, 4 metrics, I'll show you in one second, for every metropolitan region in the country. And I should say we did this back in between about 2010 and 11. So this is the material, the numbers themselves are dated, but the ideas are still there. So under the regional economic capacity, I won't define them all now. We can go into any one of them in the Q&A. Simply we said, you've got a business environment that may or be more or less dynamic, and the more dynamic it is, we think the more resilient your community will be. Affordability had to do with a relationship between housing costs and income. So people who were spending more or less than about 35% of their income on their housing. Economic diversification had to do with the shape of the economy and how diversified it was. Think stock portfolio when I say that, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket, which is a kind of vulnerability and risk-bearing, and perhaps not resilient. If you were more diversified, more like the nation as a whole, let's say, that would be a capacity factor. And then finally, income equality, which at the time wasn't getting the kind of press it's getting now, but that notion that we're more resilient to the degree that we don't have these wide gaps between the haves and the have-nots. We can be more resilient to the degree that we have income equality. So that was that category. For the socio-demographic capacity, we measured 4 things also, and I should say we set these all up in non-conventional ways so that the higher the score for the metropolitan region, the more resilient we were hypothesizing it would be. So that's why they don't look quite as normal the way you usually see them. But nonetheless, The more people have insurance, this is before the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare, so in those days it was important to know who had insurance and who didn't. We said the more people who have insurance in your area, the more secure they will feel, the more, in the case of a shock or a strain, they'll be resilient. Similarly, out of poverty, you usually measure the poverty rate. We were measuring essentially 1 minus the poverty rate, the percentage of your people who are out of poverty because of the capacities and the opportunities that would bring you if you were out of poverty, poverty being a kind of constraint. Without disability, this is a bit of a proxy on age of a region. People with disabilities tend to be those who are older. Younger people tend to have fewer disabilities. Obviously, that's not to a person, but that was a way of thinking about how your capacity to change in the moment tends to be easier if you don't have the disabilities. And finally, educational attainment, the degree to which you could draw upon that kind of capacity as well, having your education. Finally, under community connectivity, we started with voter participation, and we said that's a proxy for a kind of engagement in a community. And to the degree that people are getting out and voting in their localities, in the state, in county, in the nation, national elections, we were going to use that as a proxy for people being engaged. And the hypothesis was, of course, that the more engaged we are, the more resilient we will be. We'll know one another. We'll be caring about our community. Similarly, home ownership, a kind of proxy for that sense of commitment to place, the rootedness in place. Home ownership, we tended to know that people felt more secure with the home ownership. When you had high rental populations, it might signal something about that next indicator, metropolitan stability, which had to be due with the degree to which people had stayed with some kind of longevity in that region, or the degree to which they were moving in and out. When people are moving in and out, some transient communities tend to be less resilient, we hypothesized, because you wouldn't have people, again, knowing each other. They wouldn't know resources. They wouldn't know where to go in the moment. And so that stability of being in place was something that we hypothesized. And then finally, what we called civic infrastructure, which was a measure that had to do with the density of organizations, civic organizations in your region. And we hypothesized that to the degree that there were a lot of nonprofits and civic groups working on issues and caring about places, environment, economy, et cetera, that was a sign of a kind of capacity to be resilient in the moment. Measured them all, threw the data together, and I'm going to show you what we found. So first, the geography of what we found. So this is hard to see probably from where you are, but I'll tell you that the blues and the greens are high capacity for resilience. The buff color is medium, and the low and very low are the orange and the red. These are quintiles. Those of you who are mathematical, quintiles, you'll know that we just divided the 361 metropolitan areas. The first 72 we called very high with their scores. The next 72 we called high, et cetera. Now, what you're going to see are some obvious things. Well, first of all, we'll put up Racine, which comes up high for resilience. But what you're going to see in general is that the East and the Midwest tend to be much higher in resilience than the West and the South. And you can begin thinking about places that have high housing costs, that are growing very rapidly, so their stability, metropolitan stability tends to be low. Places that might have a lot of churn, that if you were doing if this were a map of population growth rates or even job growth rates, it might almost look the opposite. But what we were beginning to find is that, at least by hypothesized metrics, places that had more stability and tended to be slower growing tended to be the places that you might say were more resilient to a stress or strain. So kind of interesting, ran a lot of data. Obviously, we looked at all of the maps like this for only some of those indicators alone and did a lot of work. But this is how it comes out in general. And you'll see that Wisconsin, with a number of metropolitan regions, has all of them in the high or very high resilience. Well, that's good news if you believe in those indicators. Now, that said, what about Racine? Where did it come out in the indicators? Now, first, my qualifiers. The data are old, so they would have to be updated, and this is still from data, 2009 to 2011. 361 metros, and a few things that I'm going to tell you later were left out. But these are the indicators, and these are your scores. Now, these scores, for those of you who are mathematicians, are what's known as a z-score. You can think of it in terms of, this won't help those who aren't mathematicians, but those who are, you can think of it in terms of it's a statistic that's the number of standard deviations away from the metropolitan average. For those who aren't mathematicians, think in terms of, are we positive or negative? Positive means you're above average metropolitan, negative means you're below average, and the magnitude of above or below tells you how strongly, standard deviations, but how far away from that average you are relative to other places. So you can see where your pluses and minuses are. Generally, you had 2 minuses in the, that's the economic area. Those top 4 indicators are the regional economic area. You have only 1 that's a minus in the area that has to do with socio-demographic characteristics. That's an educational attainment. And then you have 1 that's a minus, the civic infrastructure, again, comparative to all other metropolitan regions. And you have 1 that's above 1, which means more than a standard deviation above the mean, and is your voter participation. So you get out to vote. So your category scores and ranks. So you came out 214th out of 361 metros in your regional economic capacity, your resilience capacity. So medium. You came in, and this is entirely coincidental, you were ranked 92 out of 361 metros for both the community connectivity and also the civic infrastructure. So you came out high in both those. Overall, you came out 110th of 361 metro areas, a little bit above the metropolitan average, and that was high. And then I should also note that your rank in the Midwest, because remember the Midwest was high in general. There are 89 metropolitan areas in the Midwest. You came in 50th. So you were a little below the halfway point when you were comparing yourselves against only the metropolitan areas in the Midwest. In terms of small metropolitan areas, which Racine is one, and I should mention that Racine as a metropolitan area, it's the entire county of Racine, is what the data unit of analysis is. You came in 43rd out of 183. So for small metros, you were actually quite high up in that area as well. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but how do we compare to places? So let's do that. There's your scores in terms of your ranks and what the quintile was, medium, high, low, et cetera. Here's Milwaukee right next to you, very similar in some ways. It was lower in its regional economic capacity for resilience. It was similarly, very similar sociodemographically in terms of its rank and also its status, if you want to put it that way. And it was a little significantly higher, and in fact ranked very high on its community connectivity for an overall score, similarly high, 99th out of 361. I was asked by the organizers at the Johnson Foundation to think about a few other metropolitan areas you might compare yourself to. So I picked a few that were single county metropolitan areas in the Midwest so that you can see how this played out with other communities. Dubuque was one of the highest in the nation, came in 5th overall out of 361. I don't know Dubuque. It's not, I'm not betting horses here, but it happened to have very good scores on everything in terms of its ranking and where it landed. So maybe some things we could learn from Dubuque. Kankakee and Decatur, you can see that they achieved medium resilience overall. That's that right-hand column, their overall resilience capacity, but they did it in different ways. Kankakee very high economically, but low in both its sociodemographics and its community connectivity for a medium overall. And Decatur, medium in its regional economic capacity, medium also sociodemographically, excuse me, but very high in connectivity. So you can see how you could imagine this with 361 metros. There were 361 stories to tell, and we told quite a number of them. So stick that together with as we go ahead then. And say, if that's what resilience is, a function of that capacity and performance, then what about a couple of things that aren't in this situation? What, for example, about your environment? What about your climate? What about the quality of your air? What about the quality of your water? What about the soils? What about your terrain? And we could not measure that. It's not that it's not important for resilience. In fact, we hypothesize that it's very important for you to be resilient, to have clean air and water, for example. But we couldn't measure it for metropolitan areas, so we left it out. Similarly, we had no good way of measuring your infrastructure, your telecom, your electricity grids, your transit systems, your sewer and water capacity. We couldn't measure it. But again, that's not because it's not important. We think it is, but we couldn't measure it. So those were missing pieces. So you need to have those missing pieces to put into context what we showed. We showed you what we could measure and hypothesize about. But there was a third thing that was missing, and it was the other thing I've studied in my career, and it's the thing that I think is extremely important for Racine, and I would argue for every community. And the third thing that we could not measure, that we thought was critically important to resilience capacity, is what I'll call governance, which on my screen before we had to change this around a little bit, but that's governance, one word. Sorry, just worked out that way. We'll correct that as needed. But governance, and it wasn't government, it was governance. And governance in the terms of how do groups organize? In this case, how does the region organize to do something? And that do something could be anything. How do you set priorities as a region? How do you establish a vision? How do you understand your issues? How do you provide your goods and services? How do you seize opportunities or thwart crises? How do you achieve the region you want to be? How do you achieve vitality? How do you achieve efficiency? How do you achieve equity? How do you achieve resilience? So we thought a lot about this. I've thought about this my whole career. How do you do that in a space that has multiple jurisdictions and multiple players? So we know this is important, and we think that doing things collectively and having good governance, what you might call good governance, we think that's extremely important for being resilient as a community. So we couldn't measure it, and I want you to temper and put into context all of that data as I now turn to speak a little bit about this missing piece in particular. So I think of sharing a region a little bit like sharing a room, and I won't do a show of hands, but I do imagine you're sitting there saying, I shared a room. I shared a room with my sibling. I shared a room in the dorms. I shared a room in the military in my barracks. Many of us have shared a room at some point, and if you've ever shared a room, that everything is contested. The temperature of the room, the music in the room, do you let pets in the room? When do the lights go out in the room? How messy is the room? How clean is the room? And I know because you're smiling that this is familiar to you. Maybe you're sharing a room right now and arguing about those things. But sharing a room is a little bit like sharing a region. There are multiple players. Everyone has a little bit of veto. Everyone has an interest in how you share that region. And I'm talking not only about sharing the regions with municipalities and towns and villages and cities, counties, not only sharing that region with decision makers and groups that have authority to make decisions about the region, but also business groups and civic groups and households and individuals who, even though that might not be legal authority to make decisions for your region, the decisions they make every day have everything to do with how vital your region is. If I decide to move my business over to Dubuque, then that has an impact on the region. If I decide as an individual to go to college here or go somewhere else, if I decide as a civic group to pick this issue or that issue, and all of these things get together along with, so the governmental side, if you will, and the non-governmental side with all these groups, they all share this region. And the question for you ultimately is, you share a lot, you share this place, and therefore how will you organize and act to achieve and set the priorities and achieve the things that you want? Very easy said, much harder to be done. And the old thinking was that the answer to that question was structural. That if we could just create a metropolitan government, or if we could just create a box big enough around all of the community that we care about, an entity perhaps that has a decision-making authority, then we would be fine. That we could achieve what we needed to do because all the decision makers would be in one decision-making group. And I spent much of my career thinking about structure. And the argument was, I don't know why it comes up that way. The argument was that centralized governance, which is to say that notion of bigger is better, that centralized governance would do a lot that was very positive. It could promote the economy of scale. It could have you have environmental or economic coordination. It could promote equity in the sense that all the resources were collectivized already, and so you could more readily share between have and have not. But there was another way of thinking, and I'm sorry it's coming out so light there. I think you can read it. Another way of thinking said that, no, structurally decentralized government is actually preferable. Governance, I should say, is preferable. Lots of little jurisdictions, because that would promote accountability. You're very close to your leaders, and political participation. More people would be engaged in the smaller localities. And it would also promote a kind of competition that was a very productive competition between competing against jurisdictions, because frankly, if my community didn't do a very good job, maybe some of the households would move out of that community and go next door where they were doing a better job. So there was a lot of thinking about structure. And I'll sum up a lot of literature, and I'm not saying structure is unimportant, but I'll sum up a lot of literature by saying the answer was, it all depends, right? It all depends on what you're trying to achieve, what kind of structure would make the most sense. So in that thinking with a lot of groups, and especially as we were thinking about resilience, we thought it isn't really about structure. We can achieve resilience with any structure, provided we can think differently about purpose and capacity. So in this, we began talking about, what am I doing wrong? What do we need to achieve in this? So you have an actor group. What is purpose and capacity for a regional governance? And part of it is, do you have clear and legitimate leadership? Maybe the Johnson Foundation tonight is demonstrating that, right? They've brought people together and convened. Do you have the appropriate stakeholders in the room? Do you have the right people around the table for any problem you're trying to solve or any issue you're trying to address? Do those people have good relations, intra-group relations, to work with one another? Do they trust one another? So your actor group was important. Your agenda was important. Have we picked the right issues to address? Are these things that we can resolve or solve? Is the agenda clear? Is it appropriate? Do people in the community have a popular agreement about that or understanding of the issue that we're undertaking? Also, regardless of structure, do we have capacity internal to our region to resolve these issues? Do we have enough money? Do we have enough resources? Do we have enough information, data? Do we have the expertise in our area to tackle those kinds of things? And finally, do we have the authority to act? Can we make the difference that we want to see? Can we implement and execute? Not surprisingly, another category of purpose and capacity was external capacity. Do you have the relationships and the influence that you need to get federal support, to get state support? Are you connected to the relevant groups for that particular issue? External groups, maybe philanthropic groups. Maybe you need to go get some grant money externally. Had you built the kind of capacity you need to be successful there? And then finally, did you have experience, implementation experience? Do you have experience working together generally? Do you have activity on that particular issue? Are there groups already working on it? And if so, what's their experience been? What's the track record? How prepared are they to work together with other groups and that sort of thing? So we really switched from thinking almost exclusively about structure with regional governance to thinking about these kinds of capacities. And there's some work on that as well. Now with that, I want to turn to finally what I'll call 7. How nice. 7 pathways to 1 + 1 = 3. And it's going to sound a little like it's advice, but in fact it's quite generic, and many of these are quite simple. This is where really your power of knowing the region it needs to be called to the fore. So if I were thinking about what are your pathways to being a more resilient community, let me step you through the 7 here. The first one, perhaps the most simple of all, is have breakfast together. And I don't mean have breakfast with the same people you have breakfast with all the time, but maybe somebody you meet tonight for the first time, or maybe somebody where you don't really know where they're coming from, but you just get to know them better. And you don't have to solve any problems. By the way, I don't know if that is breakfast because there's a wine bottle on the table, but maybe that would help solve problems. Breakfast wine. In any case, but just kind of, it's a getting to know you thing. How well do we know one another? How well do we know, other people's issues and where they're coming from? One of the best examples of this is actually out of Denver, where a group of mayors began getting together. This is back in the 70s and 80s, and they just got together. And then in the beginning, it was, let's just come together and see how we feel about, a common environmental issue about the Rockies, or a common issue about the regional economy, or for a long time it was the airport. Remember when they were doing the airport in Denver? So it was just getting together, and no one of those mayors had the authority to make any of the decisions, but they began coming together, having breakfasts, doing a few forums, but most importantly, they began knowing who each other was. And they've had tremendous success with this Metro Mayor's Caucus in Denver, extending it into collaborations with civic groups, business groups, and many other environmental groups in the area. what that leads to after a number of years working together and really getting to know one another, bringing in new members, building a culture of collaborating, are things that can happen together, diversity dialogues, that without a foundation for having tough conversations around maybe issues of diversity, they don't happen, or they happen and they don't go well. So I think one of the examples I would use there is have you go look at Denver. Other communities have since done something like this with Metro Mayors Caucuses or cross-sectoral, not just governmental, but other caucuses as well, where the real enterprise in the beginning is simply getting to know one another. So what's number 2, a pathway to resilient communities? Well, it certainly is to build on strength. I don't know any community that has succeeded by building on its weakness. So build on your strength. Maybe you've got a beautiful natural environment. I said earlier, you've got a waterfront that many regions would kill for. Maybe you've got a great housing stock, a variety for different socioeconomic groups. Maybe you've got an education system that's already been regionalized, so it isn't separate little education systems, but it's already together. All of those things. Maybe you've got great wireless. Maybe you've got good connectivity to major metropolitan areas in your vicinity as well. All of those things are assets to build on and build on those strengths. So I would certainly encourage you to think about collectively, what is it that we have together? What's our common asset and strength that would be worthy of having people come together and build on? Third, and I know you have this because some people are in the audience there, is to develop your leaders, not only your leaders in general, but build people who are willing to be leaders at the regional scale, which is to say to take off the small locality hat and put on the large hat for the region and really begin thinking about what could we do together in the future. Leadership Indianapolis, one of gazillion examples of this. You have a Leadership Racine also. And this is where, if your group is like the other groups, a big part of what these groups do is learn about all of the systems and what other people are doing in their area. So Leadership Indianapolis, Cleveland also turned their leadership enterprise into something they call the Leadership Center there, where they do a lot of workshops and trainings on becoming a leader with youth groups and all other groups in the area, nonprofit sector. There are a number of emerging leader groups. These are emerging leaders, sometimes in terms of young professionals, as it says there, other times in terms of people who have ascended to a leadership post and they're relatively recently in that. These are all over the country. You have them yourself. So certainly developing that leadership capacity is a big part of, I think, a pathway to resilience. Fourth, maybe because I love data, but also because I've seen it work, data itself is a thing, but the process of collecting that data and deciding what's important to the region and which indicators matter and what's the most telling and what are our goals around those data, all of that becomes the process, becomes the product. When people come together and say, we do care about economic prosperity, we do care about the environment, we do care about social cultural vibrancy. These are the indicators out of something called Sustainable Dubuque. And again, something that they've worked on for a number of years. And then groups can split off and begin to do good work around each of those. Simply coming up onto the screen are other examples of these kinds of projects all around the country. There are multiple numbers of these. I will point out only the Ventura County State of the Region reports. This is data collection and reporting, monitoring, measuring, is done by something called the Civic Alliance, which is a cross-sectoral, mostly business-led group that's thinking about, as it says here, advancing regional stewardship and dialogue. So that sounds pretty regional collaborative. Number 5, this is the one that's the most specific, perhaps, in what I've got up on the screen, but this is the notion that you have shared assets. You have things that are in one community, but people all around use them. RAD is the Regional Asset District for Allegheny County. That's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that for many years has incurred or really charged itself a 1% sales tax increment that they put strictly into cultural assets for Allegheny County. Libraries, parks, any of the museums, that kind of thing, zoos. So that's really exciting. So they have raised millions and millions and millions of dollars through a 1% sales tax increase, as you might imagine, over the years, that's pumped right back into those regional assets. This is a statistic, this happens to be from the Denver, has a regional asset district as well, recognizing that in this case, 73% of the people who visit some of Denver's major scientific and cultural facilities live outside the city. May be true here as well, that people who are coming in to see the Racine Museum of Art, which I saw earlier today, the art museum, many people coming from outside of Racine itself. Well, could we collectively share the expenses and also the glory of all those places? Examples from St. Louis, examples from Oklahoma City. There are communities that have thought a lot about this. I know Milwaukee has thought about this as well. How do you collectivize the responsibility and the resource allocation so that we can ensure that we have those things, philharmonic orchestras, ballets, et cetera, and recognize that we all could share responsibility for them. Number 6, include everyone. You know, it's easy to imagine that this is really about the leadership of a region. I've said a lot about leadership. It's obviously very important. There are a lot of people in your region, who are part of creating the future of your region. So the including everyone can be powerful. This is an image from a bus stop in Buffalo, New York, where they were doing a project called One Region Forward. And One Region Forward was really about what do we want to be? How do we want to be a region going forward? What about our jobs, our transportation, et cetera? And they just did a little, use media, social media, and let people use their phones to click in and kind of say, you know, one question, is Buffalo Niagara moving in the right direction? You know, send A for yes, B for no, et cetera. And then when you did that, they would ask you a few more questions. And you can imagine the data collection that came from that kind of an effort. As people are waiting for the bus, they said, sure, you know, I'll answer what I think about the region. So it's really a kind of a cute little idea, but what it does is it begins getting people invested in the project One Region Forward. And then finally, after a while, think about institutionalizing your collaboration, making it a thing that happens. It is so easy to walk away from collaborative efforts. We've all done it because they're voluntary, because they're not mandated. You don't have to collaborate, you don't have to cooperate. But after a while, if you begin to institutionalize it, this is an outline of Cuyahoga County, Cleveland in Ohio. They have a Department of Regional Collaboration. That sounds pretty interesting. Mercer County, that's in New Jersey, Sustainability Coalition. Augusta, that's the Georgia-Augusta Regional Collaboration. Those begin to become things, and those things begin to have a life and begin to put on initiatives and do things together. So that's my advice, such as it is, but it's really insights and lessons from what we've watched as we looked at different communities around the area. I want to end my presentation with really one slide that's what I call the bonus questions. And so here are your bonus questions. 1, what's your community? What's your region? As I was preparing for this, I started thinking, well, Racine, that's just like one county, but what about an environmental issue, or what about an economic issue? Surely there might be some, you know, maybe it's bigger than that, right? Maybe it goes into Kenosha or Milwaukee. And then I looked at this, and I realized that really we're talking tonight about the area east of 94, and not even about the rest of the county, artificial as a county may be. So really, one of the questions you can pose for yourself is, A, what are we trying to do together? And then who's the, you know, what is the what? Where is the what? So I think it's a provocative question for you. Second, who is your community? You know, who is it? So many people in a region. This is a picture. I think it's actually a, you know, chemical polymer, blah, blah, blah. But it's nonetheless a metaphoric, you know, visual of all of those connections and all of those people connected. You know, how about young people? How about kindergartners? How about the elders? You know, who are the people in your community that we're all working for and with? Third, and this is always a toughie, you know, what's your appetite? What's your appetite for working together, really? And what's your aptitude for it? You know, how good are you at this? What's your track record? So, you know, think about those and have the honest conversations about what do we need to build? What do we need to do together? What is our appetite for doing something together for Greater Racine? Fourth, what's your mechanisms? What do you have right now in terms of organizational infrastructure or other kinds of processes for self-assessing, for knowing? I know you have some, because next week, this second part of the series will be about some of the data that people have collected for holding up the mirror and saying, here's what we look like. And that'll be a part of self-assessment. And then what are your mechanisms for deliberation? The Johnson Foundation is an enormous gift to have a place-based foundation like that, or community foundations you have in the area, because their job and their mission is to be able to bring people together to deliberate things and think about them and perhaps to act. And that's another question too. What are your mechanisms for acting regionally? It's great to know ourselves, and it's great to talk, and it's great to talk about collaboration, but what's our mechanism for acting? And those are tough questions. A fifth question that I don't have there, but is another one that came up earlier today as I was thinking. It's how can we be different together? You know, recognizing our differences in a really positive way. We don't want to be the same. I always use the baseball team metaphor here. If I'm a shortstop and you're a catcher, you shouldn't be like I am, and we need a pitcher and we need a first base person. We all have to play our positions, and we have to be distinctive. We must have different skill sets, and we must use those qualifications differently. And yet at the same time, if we're all on the same team, we have a collective interest. Win the game, go to the World Series. So think about the baseball metaphor, I think, works on being different together, because this is not about standardizing, and none of this would be about harmonizing and making everybody be the same. It's being different, but being different together. And then finally, the last question I have, how will you determine the answers to 1 through 4? What's that look like? And this is really hard. And this is where you have to begin thinking, how are we going to do that? So my sense is that we begin doing that right now, and then we adjourn for whatever refreshments you get. And we begin doing that now with a little bit of Q&A. I think I've left ourselves about 20 minutes to do that. Is that right, Ashley? And I want to thank you so much for your attention. You've been absolutely fabulous looking up at the screen. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm going to grab my stuff.
All right, we have an opportunity for questions, and I think we have somebody that's going to help bring our chairs up on the stage. Have the pregnant woman and speaker.
No, don't even touch it.
Do
Don't even touch it. Don't even touch it. See,
There we go.
Look at that collaboration.
Yes.
I mean, that is just fabulous.
Can you tell I'm going to be a great mom with the guilt that I just threw out there? Thank you.
I'm going to leave my stuff here.
Thanks, guys. We'll throw
I'll
that
put
in the middle.
that here.
Excellent.
Want me to be here? Okay, good. Thank you.
We have a question from our Facebook audience. The question
start
is,
there.
can you speak to anything you may have seen in your research regarding how communities who are fortifying their resiliency are successfully addressing mental health?
Oh, that's a really good question. Oops.
You're on.
Am I still on?
You're good.
We did not have mental health as an indicator, but I learned in my 24 hours here that you did a project on mental health with children. So if I can speak generally to that, that is a factor of security, and that is a factor of well-being. And you know, I showed the slide earlier about personalizing your ability to be resilient and to have capacity, and mental health would be a big part of that. It's part of that disability indicator. But if I could bring it right down to a group, use mental health as a stepping off point to bring it down to a group. If you think about your children in need in Racine County, think about the numbers of children you have in need, and then imagine what kind of community you will be 10 years from now when those children are coming of age, and then maybe 20 years from now when those children are into the working age population. I feel like I'm reverbing here. I'll go down a little. Then imagine what kind of a community can you have, will you have, if we don't address now those children in need. And similar thing could be said about mental health kinds of issues. So I don't have anything in particular, but I will say as a generic set of categories, it's really about imagine what your community would be. It would be gangbusters if you could address some of those kinds of issues.
Great. Thank you. So does anybody in the audience have any questions? Please wait for Alan, who's walking around with the microphone. Stand up, introduce yourself, ask your question. And
Mike
we'll move on to
Frontier,
the next.
old codger, one of the older folks here. In 1976, the Dominican sisters who brought so much to create a community here, the healthcare network, the Women's Resource Center, they held a town hall meeting for the bicentennial of our country. And the number one issue was the interstate divide.
Ah, it's
1976, 41 years ago. If we'd have worked on that, we'd probably have the train now. Anyway, I just want to give a sense of urgency. We're running out of time here. We need to work together to make this collaboration happen. Thank you.
Thanks. Mike? We've got 2 questions up here. Alan, we'll start with Tom and then go to Trevor.
Thank you. I'm Tom Bueller from Visioning a Greater Racine.
Oh, that's a good name.
Thank you. And, you know, from a gut level, the idea of collaboration, I certainly am on board with. But I didn't really get from your speech or your presentation from a data level. You know, so you used the word hypothesis. And what I didn't really get was, like, what was the outcome, and what, from a data level, can you say now you have proof that collaboration makes sense?
Right, so that's a really good question, because there are 361 metro areas, all of which will say we're collaborating at different scales. And I can't come up and say to you, I will guarantee that if you collaborate, you'll get better, or you'll be resilient, or you will be able to fight against that stress or strain. And if you'll allow me to personalize it again for a second, we all know people who have everything going for them. You might think of a region that has everything going for itself. They collaborate well, they've got great economy, et cetera. And then something happens. Maybe it's the earthquake, maybe it's the fire, maybe it's the business that leaves. And it isn't resilient. In fact, it falls apart a little bit. People move away, things don't go well. And we also know the opposite of it. We know communities that haven't collaborated all that well. We know that they don't have much going for themselves in terms of regional economic capacity, let's say. But in the moment, and we know people this way too, in the moment, they rise to the occasion. And they might do what's known as, you know, sort of overperform. So I can't tell you that there's an answer, that collaboration is automatically the thing. What I can tell you is that we believe that when people collaborate and they know each other better, they tend to be able to have those better outcomes. The best way to find that out would be through case studies, and we did not do case studies. What we did in this part of the project, some other people did case studies. What we did in this part of the project was say, let's look at a data collection across the way. I wish I could say to you, oh, that is the answer, that's your salvation, but I will say that it's more complex than that. We've had groups work together for years. We have groups working together for years in Buffalo. It's still got some pretty crummy indicators, and it's working hard at it. But we believe that there's something that happens when people come together. So I'm going to still hold it out. Yes, hypothesis, but we don't have any answers for that entirely. Same thing you could say about the structural answers as well. If only we had a metropolitan government. You know, if only we had county government, we got rid of all the localities. But poverty won't go away. You know, it doesn't guarantee anything to do one little change. So all I would say is we believe deeply in what we observed, that when communities came together and began at least setting the agenda together and imagining what they could work on together and picking off those things that they thought they could have some success on, that those tended to be the communities that felt better about themselves and also began to move forward in perhaps a more entrepreneurial way, or at least in a way that action was a part of what they believed in. So I'm sorry, it's not exactly what you want, because I can't make promises, but I will say that it's something that we determined to be important.
Thank you. Trevor?
First, I want to say welcome to the Kringle capital of America,
Wow.
Racine, Wisconsin.
That's great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Trevor Young with Visioning a Greater Racine as well. So I wanted to say first that I really appreciated your distinction between acute shock and chronic stress.
Yeah.
And I would say, I think it's agreement in the room that Racine faces that type of chronic stress. Mm-hmm. You know, we haven't had that natural disaster, but we've had that changing global economy that has really impacted our area. So if you look at, and you use the Minneapolis Bridge example, right. You had R.T. Rybak, who was the mayor at the time, Democrat, Tim Pawlenty, who was the governor, Republican. That bridge brought those two together.
Yes,
you had the President of the United States fly in, and you had state resources, you had local resources, federal resources, and the bridge is better today because it also includes multimodal transportation. Mm-hmm. So not only did they go back to normal, as you were saying, mm-hmm. but they're better. So how in Racine can we have that sense of urgency, as Mike was saying right. in the back, and be better than normal? Right.
That's a great question. So what we did find is that the ability to come together around something was much easier for the acute shock than for the chronic stress. People do tend to rise to that occasion. Even in New Orleans, they came together rapidly. Federal dollars, state dollars, money poured in from around the country to help the people in New Orleans. And I remember at the time there was one editorial written, and they said, boy, I bet Detroit wishes it had Hurricane Katrina. because Detroit had lost just as much population. It had all of the indicators that were just as weak as New Orleans had, but it didn't have any of the attention. It didn't grab it. So that's the first part of that, which is that we did determine and did find that the acute shock did tend to bring people together across ideological lines and all other sorts of dividing lines, and that they could focus on that thing together. You've also heard people say, never waste a good crisis. So you don't want to manufacture crisis, but you do want to create that sense that we have to do something, we have to do it now. A couple of people have said it already. So I don't know, again, you would know this better. I don't know if you have a school system issue. I don't know if you have an infrastructural issue, if there's an economic issue, if there's an environmental issue. But I would think about what is the thing you want to do together. I will qualify it in this one way. To start with the hardest thing can be the hardest thing. And so what you want to do is also build some momentum that we can do things together and the sky won't fall. You know, it is possible to do a couple of things. So maybe there is support for a regional asset, or maybe there is something that is a real strength that we can do together and agree upon something. You know, you probably feel the same way about the Milwaukee Brewers or something right now. You know, probably something you can come together around. But so it could be that the first part is just an imaginative moment or exercise to say, what's our common ground? And what are the things that we would go to the mat for in this region? Is it our waterfront? Is it whatever? And then as you get good at this, because like a baseball team, you got to practice, you know, the double play or something. As you get good at your handoffs, then you begin to say, now what could we tackle that are some of the biggies that we haven't been able to really, you know, get to the heart of. Yeah, thank you. You can ask questions of Ashley, too.
No.
You may ask questions of Ashley, too.
It's nice to see you here, Ashley, and good luck on the birth of your second child.
Thank you.
I'm Jean Jacobson, the former county executive of Racine County. And I want you to leave Racine with a case study.
Okay.
Because we have done something here. When I was the county executive, for 30 years, the municipalities were trying to get together to agree how to get the sewer and water out to the interstate. What we did was invite all the municipalities, the heads of those municipalities together. And I'll tell you how I did it. Mm-hmm. We contacted the business communities and asked if we could use their boardrooms once a month, and if they would host us so we could gather once a month to talk about how we could get this project done. Two things were accomplished by this. One was that the businesses realized that municipalities were all getting together to do something for the community, and the elected officials learned what the businesses were doing for the community, what the products were that they were manufacturing, and how many people they employed. It was a wonderful thing to do. Yes, we started out with wine at the S.C. Johnson locality, and Twin Disc wanted to do them up one, and we had lobster the next time we got together. It was a great competition. At the auto auction, we had tacos out on the interstate. But it was a fun project, a lot of gnashing of teeth, but it got done after 2 years. So yes, you have breakfast together. And an interesting part of this is that the heads of all these municipalities, many had never met each other. They had read about each other in the paper, seen pictures of each other, had never met. And after the very first meeting, they learned where they came from, how many kids they had, where their kids were going to school, what college they were attending, and they became friends. The next meeting, we began to get down to business. So your number one item, have breakfast together. I can't tell you how much that meant.
Yeah.
So take that story back and tell other
Thank you.
municipalities
Thank you. I appreciate
how
it.
a big project can get done.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
Racine County did it.
Thank you, Jean. I think we have time for one final question, if there is one in the audience or online.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation tonight. I really enjoyed that. So my name is Brian. I'm with Gateway Technical College, and this is my 12th year in Racine, and I'm very proud to be a resident of Racine. I came from Madison, so it's easy to compare communities. And when you're doing assessments of your assets, judgments are based on what your personal experience has been. So I would ask the question of how could we go about assessing what our assets are and how valuable are they to our region, because we may be overlooking some of our greatest assets and not taking advantage of it.
Right, let me turn it back. There are many communities have done what, asset studies, essentially, that they go out and they map their assets. It's called asset mapping. And sometimes United Way's do it about needs assessment. You could have your visioning groups do it. You could have your leadership groups do it. But it's, again, this is another instance where the process is the product as well. It's the getting together to say what are our assets and throwing them up on butcher paper on the wall and brainstorming that you can begin to work together. So there's no one answer to how to map assets, but it is an excellent exercise. It can be done by educational groups. You can do it with the universities. You can do it with all sorts of people. I think next week you have Rob coming in, Henkin coming in. He'll be giving a lot of data as well, and some of that might be identifying assets. I often think of assets as environmental. I think of them as institutional. So you've got an opera company or something, that these can be anything that people care about that they could have shared interest about. And that could be a lot of things. And I would venture to not forget people as assets, because it's the people part of it that can often be things that we do care about. It's the kids, it's the whatever, and our elders. And how can we care about those? So there's not one way of mapping assets, but if you went to Google and said asset mapping, you would find more than enough examples of how other communities have done that.
Great. Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I actually have one final question for you, which is if you could leave us with one piece of advice moving forward, what would it be?
Why do they always do one piece of advice? I just gave you
have a couple.
lot of them.
Or the one thing from your presentation.
I think I would emphasize something I haven't said yet, which is that it's easy to say I'm sitting here at the Johnson Foundation, but there is an asset when you have a place-based community, a place-based institution, a place-based philanthropist, because those are institutions that aren't going anywhere. You don't have to worry that they're going to leave. Ultimately, you have very deep, also corporate assets, places that have committed to this region, and they're not leaving also. So I think I would put the burden and an obligation even on place-based things, governments and those kinds of place-based funders, and say, think about, as you're achieving one thing, that you don't kind of harm another thing. It's really hard. It's like if you want to grow, let's say, and you're growing jobs, well, maybe some people will be disadvantaged by that. Or if you're focusing only on opportunity, maybe growth won't be advantaged. The hardest thing of this, I think, altogether is imagining your landscape and saying, how can we make sure that as we succeed in one area, we're not simply displacing and hurting people in another? And I think place-based funders can give money to the kinds of efforts that will be attentive and mindful of those kinds of trade-offs that happen all the time. Because this is tough business. Any place I've been has not solved this. Any place I'm living at has not solved this, because it's not a thing to solve so much as a process that we go through. So I would say to really consider your institutional assets, and particularly your place-based funders.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Foster. And thanks to all of you for your interest and engagement. And we really hope that the conversation does not stop here, that you all continue to talk about this after this presentation over at Hospitality, but also online. Follow us on Facebook. Share the video from tonight with your friends and colleagues that you think would find this interesting, and continue to share ideas and comments. Also, in the last few minutes, you all should have received a survey to evaluate the briefing tonight in your email. So, magic of the internet and email. And if you could take a couple of minutes while you're walking over to hospitality or while you're waiting in line for a drink, please fill out our questionnaire. We really value the feedback, and we take it to heart and integrate it into our work. The other thing I want to do is just quickly preview the next couple of weeks, as Dr. Foster has done an awesome job tonight, really exploring how neighboring communities like ours are joining forces in new ways to create regional centers of growth with a brighter future for everyone. And next Wednesday, June 21st at 5:30, Dr. Rob Henkin is going to unveil a comprehensive, fact-based comparative analysis of kind of the resiliency-related economic trends across communities, taking a look at how Racine compares to other counties in southeastern Wisconsin, but also how our municipalities relate to one another, and a closer look at our municipal data east of the I. And then on Wednesday, June 28th, our final briefing, Rebecca Ryan is going to lead us on a really engaging and interactive journey along kind of the roadmap to creating a resilient future here in Racine. So with that, I'm really excited to see all of you here in the next couple of weeks. See you afterward at hospitality for those of you that are here. Please talk to people about what was most thought-provoking about tonight, and what questions this has raised for you, and what might you do in terms of taking an action as a result of some information that you gained tonight. So thank you all on behalf of the Johnson Foundation, and we will see you next week.
There is a way to engage in civil dialogue. Nothing really big has ever happened in this country or anywhere in the world that didn't involve a discourse that can take place in an environment that's a neutral environment, in an environment where people feel free to express themselves, but also feel free to listen to each other.